Yeah, well, thanks for joining us here today, and just come to give you a bit of an update. We, of course, had our virtual finance ministers meeting with Minister Freeland and all the ministers of finance across the country. So it was a productive discussion that we were able to talk about Manitoba's priorities, and of course, a part of that, the big priority is the health transfer funding. We need to make sure that's an ongoing basis is the #1 priority for Manitobans. We also spoke with the federal government, Minister Freeland, about the need for sector-specific support for things like restaurants and accommodations and tourism industry. There was some discussions in their update on that, so we pressed for those issues, and probably a third front was infrastructure spending, the ISIP funding, that's the federal provincial, ensuring that there's timely access and approvals of these fundings. So those were the priorities that we laid forth with the federal government. So I think it was a very productive conversation. There was good dialogue and discussions in terms of the health funding that's there. There was also some agreements with the federal government and other ministers of finance on growth strategies going forward, such things as interprovincial trade, which is a real priority for Manitobans, as well as taking advantage of things like our hydroelectricity power, which I know is a priority for the federal government. And digitization of our commerce system is extremely important, as well as investments in long-term education, making sure that the labor forces were there. So it was a very, I think, very productive conversation in a little bit different setting. Usually we meet in Ottawa, of course, or wherever where the meeting is held, and so we had some productive discussions with the federal government. Is there any questions at all? We, of course, also released our pre-budget consultation, so we're extremely excited about that. This is my third budget as the Minister of Finance, and so we're excited. A big part of that, of course, is going around to Manitobans. This year is a little bit different because of the unique nature of the pandemic. So we're doing most of those consultations on a virtual basis in communities across the province, as well as telephone town hall meetings. And we did some of that last year. Sometimes you get upwards of 7,000 to 8,000 people on these calls. And so that's really an opportunity for us to listen to Manitobans on the priorities, the needs of Manitobans. So we're really looking forward to starting that out. And Manitobans can also go to engagemb.ca to give a survey in terms of what their priorities for Manitobans are. And we've, of course, during the time of the pandemic, had close to 300,000 Manitobans that have access and given us their opinions on everything from the pandemic to policies. And I think last year we had close to 18,000 people participate in our budgeting process. So we're excited for both those things to happen. And so if there's any questions or comments from anyone, I'd love to take them for you. Well, right now we're in our budget consultation. We are waiting from the federal government on decisions on things like the health transfer payments. We generally have our budget in March. This year, because of the pandemic, it is a little bit different, a little bit of a unique setting. We again are waiting for the federal government for this important information that has been discussed with the Prime Minister and the Premiers. So we anticipate it being a little bit later this year, but until we get the information from Ottawa, we can't set a date. This is generally the process we do. We listen to Manitobans and then we'll set a date for the budget. Well, number one, we have provided over $400 million of supports to businesses, but one thing that we really did hear from the sectors here, there was a commitment made in the economic update by Minister Freeland about supports for things like people in the restaurant as well as accommodation services. What they announced at that point, and we didn't hear any further details on that, was an interest-free loan up to $1 million, interest-free loan over a 10-year period, or a loan guarantee rather. So we pressed, and there was a number of provinces beyond Manitoba that pushed for that. So we really do need to hear that from sectors that have been impacted by the health sector. That matches our $400 million commitment to businesses that we've given through things like the Bridge Grant Program and things like the Gap Protection Program. I think for the Bridge, for instance, I think we've had close to about 1,800 restaurants that have applied and got accepted, and somewhere around 2,700 retail settings for it.
For the next couple of weeks, because the Bridge Grant runs out at the end of January, and that's only going to still be 2 weeks in February before we even talk about extending or ending health orders again. still a lot of businesses who are kind of left out on that. I know there's $5 million for dine-in restaurants to help them convert, but beyond that, there's not a ton else at this point that's still active from the province in terms of those supports that are continuing to help them through this.
Well, we continue to evaluate that on timelines of when that would happen, so we'll have further discussions with industry as we continue to do on these supports. I can say that we have provided upwards of $400 million of supports to businesses. We want to continue to do that. There is also an agreement with the Winnipeg and Manitoba Chamber of Commerce as well as Economic Development Winnipeg, $50 million to have supports that are in place. So we're going to continue to have those discussions. Quite frankly, we do want to see what the federal government has to offer, and some of their programs have been very good, I'll have to say, with the wage subsidy and others, but we do and have heard specifically from restaurants and industries like that, they do want to hear about the commitment that was made from the federal government. And that was our priority to really focus on that, to make sure we're getting some answers. It was a very good meeting for the most part, and the details will be coming out fairly soon in respect to that.
When you say fairly soon, are we talking next week or are we talking weeks from now?
Well, it's a federal government program, and so we pushed them and we said that above and beyond the provincial supports and the federal supports that have been in place already, and they have been good programs. We do need further answers in terms of what that will look like. Again, we are working with the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Winnipeg. One that you had mentioned, of course, was a rebate for things, delivery types of services, whether it be skip the dishes or other types of where businesses can rebate, the restaurants can rebate those appropriate places. There, again, has been a number of restaurants, upwards of 1,800, that have applied and got approved through the Bridge Grant program. And the retail setting, I think it's over 2,000, I think 2,700 if I'm not mistaken. Retail businesses have got up to the $10,000. I want to say we're not done with supports yet, and so we're going to continue to evaluate. We've kind of taken pride in the fact that they have been flexible. We've made some changes even with the Bridge program 2 or 3 times. So if we have to look at deadlines or the amounts, we're certainly having discussions with the industries on those things right now.
You mentioned the health funding. It's been a big push from the province for months and months now for the federal government to increase their share in medical costs or healthcare costs. Did Mr. Freeland shine any light on that for you guys? Did she give you any confidence or hope that there would be an increase in this type of spending and funding they get?
Yeah, of course, there was a First Minister's meeting with the Prime Minister, and I think the Prime Minister made some very positive comments on that, and so we had positive dialogue with Minister Freeland, but what we're hearing clearly from Manitobans, it's time to show us the money when it relates to healthcare funding. We as a province have spent about $633 million above and beyond the initial $6.6 billion that we spent into the healthcare system because of the pandemic. We'll be spending more, but we know that the healthcare needs of Manitobans will continue on well past this pandemic in a whole bunch of different areas. An example of why we think that it should be in encumbered money or flexible is there could be different priorities for different areas. So for example, for us, some of the operations and that sorts that have been delayed, there's going to be some delays that are related to that, or in areas that we may focus in on for healthcare would be wait times. These may be different from areas of Quebec or BC or other regions. So we want the flexibility to invest in these areas that are priorities for our own provinces.
So just to be clear, so getting back to businesses and funding programs for businesses, you won't be announcing any new funding programs for businesses until you hear from the federal government?
No, I didn't say that at all. I said that we continue to. We've invested more than $400 million in supports for businesses. If you look at overall our investments, we identified in our Q2 midterm report about $3.2 billion of supports. That's in health and education and a whole bunch of different areas. We do think, and we have heard from industry, it is important to identify what that priority was for the federal government. And I said, as we have before, if you look at the example of the Bridge program, we've made changes all the way along. We first had businesses that were just impacted by the health orders, then we went to home-based businesses, and then we went to additional businesses, and we extended the deadline. So we're continuing to look at that. We don't necessarily need to have the indication from the federal government, but we have clearly heard from industry it is important to get that commitment down. So we raised that with the federal government, and we're going to continue to support businesses and make changes to our programs.
Are you still expecting a deficit to be $2 billion, around $2 billion?
am willing to go up in terms of the deficit? Well, listen, our goal as government is to do two things: to protect Manitobans and to support businesses and individuals. Okay, so we're going to do what it takes in a time of need that I think most Manitobans would want us to make those investments. And the fact that we are going to be running a $2 billion deficit and the money is being invested in areas like healthcare and supporting Manitobans and businesses is important. So we absolutely look at more expenditures if needed and when needed, but we're going to do that in an appropriate way.
Do you see the upcoming fiscal year as one more of recovery where you're still going to be into significant deficits, or do you see the upcoming fiscal year more as one where you can start to chip away at the deficit?
Well, we had a presentation from the Governor of the Bank of Canada in our presentations today, and what he indicated is it's more realistic that 2023 is more of a time when we realistically get back to where we were prior. If you look at the minister in Quebec, he indicated that could be 2025. What the Governor of the Bank of Canada indicated is that he sees the first 2 quarters of this year not being as rosy as it once was, of course, because of the restrictions that are in place. But I think it's really driven obviously by the pandemic, and if there's further restrictions, the restrictions last longer in place, then obviously the outlook gets worse.
So you don't see this upcoming fiscal year as one where you can start chipping away at a deficit. You see it more as a recovery year or a year where you're going to have to continue to make, you're going to have to continue to do quite a bit of spending to pay for pandemic-related things, and you're still going to be dealing with lower than normal revenues.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We know, obviously our fiscal year ends at the end of March, so we anticipate the supports and the restrictions potentially could go on longer than that. Our hope is we get the vaccine up and running and people get the herd immunity that happens, and so we can move away from that and move to recovery. But as a government, what this budget focuses on protecting Manitobans, number one, when they need the support, as well as providing some supports for businesses. And on a long-term basis, looking at that recovery, what it looks like when we have more vaccines in the community and we're through it. Manitoba got hit pretty hard in October. And so we are kind of an island, I guess, amongst others, in terms of being able to lack some of that. And I think that's largely to do with a lot of the good work that Manitobans have done. I think most Manitobans have really taken to social distancing and other measures to support. There's a few people, of course, that are still flaunting those rules, but as soon as we can get to new norm, I think the budgeting process will get a little bit easier. So to answer your question directly, yes, I think next year is still a year where you're going to be seeing more supports for individuals, whether it be health or education, or supports for businesses past the March 31st deadline of this year. Well, we are waiting, Tom, on some information from the federal government. The big piece, of course, is healthcare funding, and so there obviously is a proposal, and I think there was some good discussion from the Prime Minister on that. So they haven't set their deadline for their budget, so we do need some more information. We're going to try work as hard as we can to get it done. It'll probably be later than it has been over the last 2 years, which is the early part of March. But our hope is to get it out sooner rather than later, on a kind of a normal schedule. Again, I would say normal schedule would be March, and potentially April would be the latest. But quite frankly, we need to get more information from the federal government on things like what the healthcare funding will be.
When we look at the deficit from this current fiscal year and likely this next fiscal year, to help balance that out, I know the province has been cutting or deferring taxes for businesses, for individuals at this point. Do you see taxes potentially, whether it's PST or other forms, going up in the next fiscal year or two to help cover some of these deficits? Is that something that people should keep in mind as they start giving you guys some feedback as to what they would like to see?
Well, right now our main focus is to support Manitobans, protecting Manitobans when they need it most, which is during a pandemic, and providing supports for individuals and businesses. And I'm just going to list off a couple, then I'll answer your question directly. Things when we talk about individual supports for businesses, or rather for individuals, That's things like the risk recognition program. That was the program. Maybe it's a grocer that's working there. Anyways, long story with that is there's been over 337,000 Manitobans that have been supported by programs like that, 79,000 in that program. There's a seniors economic recovery, over 230,000 Manitobans. So that represents almost, when you think of it, $1.3 billion population, $1.3 million population. That's a large supports for individuals as well as supports for businesses. So to answer your question right now, we've laid out a plan in our throne speech to get ourselves back into balance in an 8-year time period. We think that is realistic. But what I would preference the fact is that when we were first elected, we also laid out a plan to get ourselves back into balance in an 8-year time period. And of course, we were actually 4 years ahead of schedule in terms of that, so 4 years ahead of schedule. So we anticipate doing that. A question that you may want to ask the opposition parties would be, do they share that same promise to get ourselves back into balance in an 8-year time period? That's an important piece for Manitobans to know as we go forward.
And is the vaccine rollout, the success of vaccine campaign, having anything to do with budget deliberations? Is it anything that you're counting on or expecting, or any vaccination benchmarks coming into any of the financial planning or fiscal planning?
So you mean in terms of if we get more people vaccinated? Well, I think, I guess what I would say, they're certainly interrelated because of the fact if you get more people vaccinated, you have herd immunity that can happen. And if people follow the same social, kind of these measures, the social health measures, that has an impact of being able to get the economy rolling again. But right now, we're at a point where we need to get as many needles in arms as we can. There's been obviously a bit of a backlog that's been well addressed in the media in respect to in terms of getting the drug here in Manitoba. But there is also at our meetings today discussion, although we're the health ministers, but discussions in terms of the other vaccines that potentially could come online. And what Minister Freeland had spoke to that was obviously it's an independent process, the Health Canada, but it seems like the AstraZeneca specifically one would be imminent over the next number of weeks, but there wasn't any commitment made, and that's an independent process. So they do relate to one or the other. Once you can get more people vaccinated, you can get the economy back rolling where it was prior to the pandemic.
Are you able to, like the federal government, take advantage of some longer-term borrowing, like the credit, talking about the credit markets? The federal government's really been able to take advantage of some long-term, like 10, 25, or even looking at 50-year bonds. How does that look for the province?
Yes, we have taken advantage of 2 century bonds, which is kind of unheard of at very low interest rates. One thing that has been 100-year bonds, 2 100-year bonds that we were able to take advantage of. I can get you some more details on that. I don't have it right in front of me here, Tom. But so yeah, we have taken advantage of that. The problem, and it actually wasn't well highlighted at that point, but in the time of March, it was really hard for provincial sub-sovereigns to actually go to the capital markets. And there was some real concerns. And, there's a lot of talk of the rainy day and how important that was. I mean, the fact of the matter is if we couldn't access the capital markets, you would, in theory, be in jeopardy of not being able to pay some of your bills. So I think having that, although we haven't tapped into that as of yet, was really important for Manitobans, and it does prepare us well to do it. Right now, we have been able, because of some of the federal, the Bank of Canada programs that have been in place, have been able to access the capital markets and obviously borrow money at a lower rate, which is important. So that's there. And I understand from the Bank of Canada, the governor today, those programs will continue to be in place for a while.
Have you been able to transition away from some of the shorter money to the longer money?
Yes, we have.
Do you see that continuing for the next year or two, or how is that looking?
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah. Absolutely, and for that, obviously the goal when you access the capital markets is to get the best interest rate you can on a long-term basis. If you can have that, that's really important. And there is some advantages in times like this where interest rates are extremely low. And so when you're able to access the capital markets, that's something that we'll do. And all provincial governments are doing that right now, and we'll have to do that for a foreseeable time. If you and I very much believe what the governor of the Bank of Canada had said is that you're going to see the real recovery start happening in 2023. So that is still a time period where Manitobans and Canadians as a whole will need supports and need healthcare and a whole bunch of other things. And so not just on the operating basis, but there's also the capital requirements and obviously maturing of old debt and as we move forward. So. Well, I don't know when the next provincial election would be, although I guess it's mandated now in terms of the timeframes for it. But what we would really like to do, and I think it's important, is to have a plan. You know, right now, Manitobans would expect us to invest money in health and education, support them when they need help. And that's what we've tried to do. But I think as we move forward, and that's been my one criticism of the federal government, there isn't a plan once you're there to get back into balance. And so we've laid out, we think, a realistic plan. We're going to talk more about that in the future days of getting back into balance on a reasonable period of time, an 8-year time period. And the one point I would mention that we've got a track record now where we've actually been able to achieve that, and we did that earlier, 4 years earlier than what we had first anticipated prior to a pandemic and coming to office. So we always, as a government, like to over-deliver, I guess, with some of our our promises that we've made.
You mentioned you haven't touched the rainy day fund yet.
Yeah.
You've been trying to put that off, but at what point do you say, okay, the government's borrowed enough money, we really should maybe go into that rainy day fund that you brought back up to $800 million,
Yeah.
and take some of that long-term pressure and long-term borrowing off the province and off taxpayers?
Yeah. Well, right now we have been able to access the capital markets. We will be dipping into the rainy day later on. We do have an appropriation through our budget bills, the 2 budget bills for $1.57 billion for supports. And the way the cash flow works is, you know, once that money is spent, then you can, you'd have to look for additional budget appropriation or a special warrant or a variety of different mechanisms to do that. So we haven't made, and we haven't had to make that decision as of yet, but once we do, then we will definitely be there. I guess, again, the advantage, and has been covered, the rainy day fund, it is cash on hand. And again, that example in March, where the fact where a provincial government, all provincial governments, not just Manitoba, couldn't access the capital markets, you know, having that cash on hand was extremely important. Any other questions at all? So I hope I'll see you guys all at our virtual budget consultations over the next week and a half. So, thanks a lot.